Welcome to Beginning with Moses, Discovering Jesus in the Bible. I'm Pastor Gary Schulte. Hello again. Welcome to episode 15 of Beginning with Moses, where we continue our study of the book of Genesis. We continue to look at the many ways Joseph is a typological titan, perhaps the clearest image of Christ in all the Old Testament.
This is big. This is big.
We begin with the first of the two titanic theological pronouncements made by Joseph that bookend the account of his life and work in Genesis. Right after finally revealing himself to his brothers in chapter 45, you may recall Joseph gives them this reassurance. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Who knew, huh? The little boastful boy beaten and thrown in a cistern? Let's look now at some very specific ways that Joseph's life and work parallels that of Jesus. First, Joseph and Jesus both possess unique eyes of faith to see beyond the curtain of observable reality and present terrible circumstance, and are able to trust God even when things are their worst. Both Joseph and Jesus see purpose. They see the big picture. I can't help but think of Alice in Wonderland peering through the looking glass. Second, both Joseph and Jesus are made to pay a price for speaking the truth about themselves, albeit out of youthful arrogance in young Joseph's case. Joseph is beaten and sold for telling his brothers about his dreams. In John chapter 10 reports that Jesus says this about himself, "I and the Father are one." This makes his enemies pick up stones to stone him to death. Third, both Joseph and Jesus are sold. Joseph to the caravan traders by his brothers, Jesus to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious council, by his disciple Judas. Fourth, both Joseph and Jesus are imprisoned. Joseph by Potiphar and Jesus by the Sanhedrin. Fifth, both Joseph and Jesus suffer innocently. Joseph attests, "I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." In Luke 23, one of the two criminals crucified with Jesus says this, "We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Sixth, both Joseph and Jesus uniquely possess the Spirit of God. Pharaoh asks in wonder, "Can we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Meanwhile, Matthew 3 records that the Spirit of God descends on Jesus like a dove at his baptism. Seventh, both Joseph and Jesus possess unparalleled wisdom. Pharaoh says to Joseph, "No one is so discerning and wise as you." In Matthew 13, the residents of Jesus' hometown marvel and ask this, "Where did this man get this wisdom?" Eighth, both Joseph and Jesus are lifted up and given all, in air quotes, authority. Pharaoh tells Joseph, "You shall be in charge of my palace and all my people." And right before his ascension back to heaven, Jesus declares, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." 9. Both Joseph and Jesus begin their ministry at the age of 30. 10th, both Joseph and Jesus feed the people and provide for them. Joseph declares, "I will provide for you and your children." Jesus, meanwhile, feeds the crowds on 2 occasions with very little at hand. 11th, both Joseph and Jesus redeem the people. Joseph redeems his people from the curse of famine and starvation. Christ redeems his people from the curse of the law. 12th, both Joseph and Jesus embody true Israel, God's servant sent to preserve a remnant chosen by grace.
This is big. This is big.
Finally, this brings us to the second mammoth pronouncement of Joseph that serves to bookend the account of his life in Genesis. This quote is basically a revisitation of the first parallel, seeing through the looking glass. Joseph states, "You, my brothers, intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." I cannot imagine a clearer summary of the paradox of what God accomplished through Christ's triumphant death on the cross. Both Satan and sinners intended to harm Jesus, but God meant it for good, for the saving of many lives. Jesus saw it through to the end. He was the ultimate doer of God's will in the face of the direst circumstance. What an amazing Christ figure Joseph is. But let's close this episode with a detailed look at the beauty of the chiastic poetry of the Jacob cycle, as his account ends about the same place in Genesis as does that of Joseph. We'll begin episode 16 with the poetic analysis of the Joseph cycle. Here's a look at our full-color view of Moses' shorter and simpler structure for the Jacob cycle. Once again, we'll leave the meat in the middle as a mystery to be unveiled at the end. The first pair of parallels, A, involved Jacob's journeys and encounters with family members. In the first half, he encounters his twin brother Esau while traveling. In the second half, Jacob's travels come to an end, along with the earthly journey of his father Isaac. In parallel B, encounters with Canaanite neighbors is the theme. Isaac and the Philistines is paired with the account of Dinah and the Hivites. Parallel C involves the blessing of Esau. In the first half, Jacob cheats his twin out of his blessing. In the second half, he sort of gives it back. Parallel D is all about Jacob's encounters with God. In the first half, he meets God at Bethel. In the second half, Jacob crosses paths with the angel of Yahweh. Parallel E concerns Jacob's coming and going with regard to his uncle Laban's house. The common element in parallel F is Jacob and Laban taking turns outwitting one another. Then there are actually two unique elements in the Jacob cycle. The first meet in the middle is the account of the birth of Jacob's sons. Moses is poetically putting an important emphasis on the establishment of covenant Israel. So what is the second and major appendix meet in the middle of the Jacob cycle? Do you have an educated guess based on our previous experience? Indeed, it does fit an established pattern. The meet in the middle is another reference to God remembering somebody. But Moses throws us a huge curve here. It's not Jacob whom God remembers, but his wife Rachel when he miraculously opens her womb. And that's not all. God remembering Rachel is at the exact textual middle of Genesis 12 to 50. In other words, it is the meet in the middle of the period of the patriarchs. Amazing. 3 massive laser beam focused reference to the covenant language of God remembering is truly amazing. But the whole idea of Zakar, God remembering, is amazing in another way too. It is the language of the Lord's Supper. Perhaps you've heard pastors repeat these words of institution 1,000 times. Do this in memory of me. Well, here's a breakdown of the actual Greek wording of what Jesus says. Tuto poiaite eis tein amen anemason. The word order is pronoun, verb, preposition, definite article, possessive pronoun, and then noun. Basically, it's this do, eis, the of my memory. In English, we would just leave that definite article, tein, out. In the Greek, it just strengthens the idea that Jesus is the owner or possessor of the noun memory. So we would say something like, this do eis my memory. This preposition eis is the key. It can mean a number of things depending on context. Sometimes it means to or in. In is actually the idea we use to come up with in memory of me or in my memory. But eis can also be translated as by in a causal sense, whenever it's found in an adverbial phrase as it is here. Have we been mistranslating the sense of Jesus' words for hundreds of years? In all humility, I think so. Here's the sentence with eis being translated as by instead of in. It totally changes the sense of what Jesus is saying. This do by the my memory. Or in proper English, this do by my memory. This do by my memory. by my memory, not in my memory, by my memory. It makes perfect sense. Who always zakars? Well, Yahweh does. Who always forgets? Man does. As we receive Jesus' body and blood, then, God is zakaring, remembering his covenant, established at Christ's cross and empty tomb anew, and applying the benefits to the individual newly in that moment. By Yahweh's remembering, we who receive the sacrament now can actually remember the Lord's death until he comes. It totally fits the theology of the entire Bible. God never changes. It is mind-blowing to consider this. It flips the entire scenario. God is always the main agent of action. It is never us. All right, back to the Jacob cycle. The main body contains 6 elements. 6 is the number of sinful man. Very appropriate for the cycle of Jacob, the deceiver. To further emphasize Jacob as sinner in need of salvation, the 6th element contains matching sins of deceit. And the problem is not limited to Jacob. Laban is also implicated as well here, as we all are. The 7th element is the creation of the nation of Israel. 7 represents the perfection of God's creative work. The middle elements of the main body on both sides are all about encounters with God. The big double meat in the middle, the appendix to the main body, is in the 8th position, which always communicates alliance and new resurrection life. Finally, God's remembering Rachel foreshadows his amazing remembrance of another female in the establishment of his worldwide covenant through Jesus. Mary, a humble, childless woman remembered and chosen by God to be the mother of the new Israel. Well, I think that's enough mind-blowing stuff for one episode. There's plenty more where that came from in episode 16 as we finish off our discussion of Joseph with an analysis of his poetic cycle. Stay with me. God bless.